Hi learners! Have you ever wondered why the verb can does not need to be conjugated? Today we will find it out, because in this video we'll be talking about modal verbs. We use modal verbs to express a lot of things. For example, ability, possibility, condition, permission, obligation, and advice. Modal verbs are a group of verbs that need to follow certain rules. There are 4 rules they have to comply. The first rule says that they are the same for all the pronouns. That is to say, we will not need to conjugate modal verbs. Then we can use all the pronouns without worrying about conjugation. The second rule says that they are followed by a verb in the base form. That is to say, we will always need to have the verb next to a modal verb in its infinitive form without to. That is how we have in the example, Sophie can dance. The third rule says that they act as auxiliary verbs. That is to say, if we want to make a negative or an interrogative sentence, we will not need to use any other auxiliary verbs, because they do that work. In the cases of the negative sentences, the only thing we are going to do is to add not. That is how we have cannot, could not, may not, might not, will not, shall not, should not, must not, would not, and ought not to. An example of this would be Sophie will not dance. And the fourth rule says that they never combine with other modals. That is why Sophie will can dance is incorrect. In this type of sentences, what we do is to replace the modal verb can by be able to. Sophie will be able to dance. Now that we know the rules, let's see what each modal verb represents. The modal verb can talks about possibilities or abilities. For example, I can play the guitar. That is an ability. Or, Sarah bought the ticket. You can go to the concert now. That is a possibility. Could. Could is the past of can. It can also talk about possibilities or abilities in the past. Furthermore, talks about conditions. An example of this would be, I could help him if I had the money. May and might both talk about probabilities, but may is more likely to happen. An example could be, it's cloudy, it may rain. On the other hand, might is less likely to happen. She might be happy if you gave her a flower. Let's continue with will. Will is used to talk about predictions about the future. For example, I will go to the cinema next week. Shall. Shall is used the same way we use will, but this is rather British English. It can also be used for invitations. For instance, shall we go to the cinema? Or, this time next week, I shall be in Scotland. Then we have should. Should is used to give advice. An example of this would be, she should speak English if she wants to learn. Must. Must represents moral obligation. You must study if you want to learn. If the traffic light is red, you must stop. Would. Would is used to talk about condition. The function of would is to condition the verb it has next to it. Sophie would dance if you invited her. And the last modal verb we have is ought to. Ought to is commonly replaced by should. They have the same meaning. An example of ought to is, my mother is sick. I ought to call her. We already know how to make affirmative and negative sentences using modal verbs. But what happens with questions? For this, we need to go back to the third rule that says that they act as auxiliary verbs. That is why we are not going to need to use any other auxiliary verbs. The only thing we are going to do is to change the position of the modal verbs. That is how, in the affirmative form, we have Sophie can dance, and in the interrogative form, we will have can Sophie dance? We are going to have exactly the same thing with all the modal verbs. Could Sophie dance? Must Sophie dance? May Sophie dance? Should Sophie dance? might Sophie dance, may Sophie dance, must Sophie dance, could Sophie dance, will Sophie dance, shall Sophie dance, should Sophie dance, with the exception of ought to. It's old-fashioned to say ought Sophie to dance, but if you want to apply it, you can do it. And that's all for today. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe.